Hello, my name is Kevin Ray Wrobetz, and I am a lecturer in the Business Administration Department at Kobe Gakuin University. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about how we can use smartphone gaming to teach our students business strategy in EFL classrooms. So in this presentation, first I would like to give you a brief overview of what exactly teaching business English is all about, why it's important for Japan in particular, and what an effective business English class would look like in Japan ideally. Then I would like to talk to you about using an actual game to teach business strategy in business English classrooms here in Japan, and more specifically to look at how we can do this. I am using the game The Settlers of Catan to teach business strategy. And then we'll move into how I conducted the study, the class that I was looking at, the principles upon which the study was founded, and the method of data analysis that I used. And finally, we'll be looking at the actual data that I collected and be discussing some of the implications of the data. So let's move right into business English. When we're thinking about what exactly business English is all about, it helps to think about how business English or how English came to dominate on a global scale. So if we look at English First's English Proficiency Index here, we have a map of the proficiency levels of various countries around the world, and we can see that almost every single country. Obviously, we don't have some data for countries like North Korea or Antarctica down here, but nearly every single country is proficient in English, and up to 20% of the population is proficient in English. And a good quarter of the world, of the countries around the world, are quite a bit better than that. Mainly these areas in Europe, areas of the Middle East, and parts of Africa as well. So obviously, and we've heard it time and time again, that English is the lingua franca of the world. But not only that, English has really come to dominate as the de facto language of research in a wide range of academic fields. So whether you're talking about the medical profession, or physics, or education, or any academic field that you look at, you can really see the dominance of English. And if we look about or think about why this is actually the case, we can look at enrollment rates in higher education in English-speaking nations around the world. So you see that obviously, the U.S. and lots of Europe and Australia have over 50% enrollment rates in the in higher education institutes, and so really English has come to overwhelm other areas or other countries in terms of the amount of research that they're exporting, and the sheer number of universities that large countries with large populations like the United States are able to produce. It just kind of overwhelms the market. So you really have this kind of double punch of linguistic dominance, of English being the lingua franca of the world, as well as this really tight grip on research publication platforms. And as we know, research is linked to innovation, and innovation is key to business success. And so really English has ensured its place as an international language of business. So if we go back to our English proficiency map, we can see that there's this really high correlation between English language proficiency and enrollment rates in the world, right? So we see these areas in Europe as well. There's this really high correlation between that, right? And so proficiency in English is tied to obviously high rates of enrollment in academic or institutions of higher education. So if we look at why this is important for Japan and how Japan uses English in business scenarios, we can look at how the Japanese economy kind of works. So we know that Japan is an export-based economy, and this trend is likely to continue. And moreover than that, we're going to see an increasing amount of Japan importing English as a language of business, even within local economies. So obviously, Japan has a long established economy founded on exportation, and so this requires Japan to interact with the global market using English as a language of business. So, pretty much everywhere you go, you're going to see Hondas and Toyotas on the road, just to name a few. But more so than that, the increasing interconnectivity of the global market has caused some Japanese companies to actually shift their internal language from Japanese to English. And this happened in the company Rakuten, where they conduct all of their business, even in Japan, in English, due to the fact that there's so much interaction with Rakuten and other international companies. Um, so you're going to see this kind of increasing demand for English language skills even within Japan. Moreover, we have a booming tourist industry here in Japan. So this is actually only to 2017. So this is probably actually, a little bit higher now in 2018 and 2019. Obviously, there's going to be a little bit of a decrease in 2020 due to the coronavirus, but this trend for the increasing number of tourists in Japan is only set to increase. Now, this means that because, as we talked about earlier, how English is the lingua franca of the world, when these tourists come to Japan and they're going to be shopping for souvenirs and going out to eat, this is going to increase the real market value, quote unquote, of English language skills in the local economy as well. So not just these huge multinational companies like Honda and Toyota, but local shops and local restaurants as well. Furthermore, with the population decrease in Japan, you see this increase in the demand for foreign laborers. So there was a 14.2% increase in foreign laborers in Japan from 2017 to 2018, and this is set only to continue. And so we have obviously a need for English skills in business scenarios, not only on a global scale for the Japanese economy, but also an increasing need in local economies as well. So how are we going to prepare our Japanese students to meet with this demand? Well, one way that we shouldn't be doing this is relying too much on textbooks, obviously, right? So there's a number of business textbooks out there, but there's also very little evidence, and this is supported by research here, that general knowledge of a subject, so for example, studying vocabulary and grammar that you can use in business scenarios, there's very little evidence that suggests that this will transfer well to context-specific situations like business contracts, for example. And in the business world, there are unfortunately a lot of context-specific scenarios that require highly specific vocabulary and highly specific grammar. So relying on textbooks only is not enough. Now, this is not to say that textbooks are bad. This is actually an image of a textbook that I use in class. But the important aspect is that, or the important thing to understand is that we can't rely on them 100%. 100%. So there is a number of research, a lot of research that suggests that task-based language teaching activities, perhaps in conjunction with textbooks, can help train our students for context-specific situations, in particular context-specific situations that are related to business. For example, like having mock meetings or having students write up and look at product reviews and having them practice business networking in the class. So we can do this. Now, this also brings us to the idea of using smartphone gaming. So what I am interested in looking at is how we can use strategy games that utilize real market principles like trade, supply and demand, and resource management, and how we can use these strategy games to serve as these novel target language tasks to help our students develop general business strategy. And this has been identified by other researchers as a successful way to help students develop strategy. So, the game in particular that I am looking at is the Settlers of Catan. And the Settlers of Catan is a game that works on the idea of supply and demand, resource management, and trade. Now, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time and tell you exactly the exact specifics of how the game works. So suffice it to say that it's a strategy board game. It was developed by Klaus Teuber, and the game involves players collecting, managing, and trading resources that are distributed by chance. And this is the key element in here. So not every single game is the same. So there's this dynamics gameplay mechanic that's kind of built in the game, and so you can collect, manage, and trade these resources that you acquire by chance or that you've acquired through skill of negotiation to essentially build or purchase your way to 10 victory points in order to win the game. Now, this game has been adapted to a smartphone application. So the smartphone application allows players to access the game tutorials, the rules, as well as the ability to connect with other players on the network to play with for free, and all in the target language of English. Now, in the class, obviously we want to, if we're going to use this in class, we want all of our students to actually play the game. And so all of the students do need access to a smartphone. However, there is a really high penetration of smartphones in the 20 to 30 age range in Japan. So there's a 94.2% penetration as of 2016. So this is probably actually a little bit higher. So we can say that there's this near universal penetration for smartphones in class, which makes it very easy for us as language teachers or teachers to kind of shift over to the smartphone as an educational platform because the students have already purchased their own smartphones. Um, and I've actually never encountered a situation in class where a student didn't have a smartphone and wasn't able to participate in one of these lessons. So it hasn't come up yet. This is not to say that it couldn't, but there is a very high level of penetration in the classroom. So next we'll move into how I actually conducted the study itself. I conducted this study in a third semester business English class during the fall semester of 2019-2020. And I was really interested in looking at how the students could use this game in order to develop a quote unquote meta strategy, right? Or a strategy to develop strategy, so to speak, in order to deal with these dynamic scenarios, right? So during the semester, I had 4 business administration majors enrolled in this class, and they played the game in order to develop business-oriented strategy for dynamic scenarios, all while using English, right? So while playing this game in English. 3 of the students were Japanese and had English proficiency levels of novice high to intermediate low, according to the ACTFL guidelines, or the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages. And 1 student was Chinese with an English language proficiency level of intermediate mid to intermediate high. So although his level was a little bit higher, everybody's English level was more or less the same. So I used a mixed method analysis to look at the data that I collected. So I was really interested in collecting quantitative data as well as qualitative data to look at how effective uh, the game was at teaching strategy, and how the students' language use was reflecting their changes in strategy, and how much better they were getting at through the game by changing and tweaking their strategies. And so really the backbone of or the basis for this study is based on the negotiation of meaning. And there have been a lot of researchers, one of whom being Mark Peterson, who have looked at how playing games can provide students with a lot of opportunities to conduct this negotiation of meaning. So they encounter something in the game that they're not exactly sure about. Maybe they're not familiar with the rules, or they're not exactly sure how to proceed forward. And by interacting with the game, they're provided with these instances of negotiation of meaning, which has been tied to improving language skills. And so I had the students download the game, read the rules in English, and then play one game a week outside of class, and all without providing them any specific instructions on how to play the game or how to play the game well. And so to ensure that the students didn't change the game's language midstream, so to speak, I had the students send me screenshots of each game that they were playing in order to kind of monitor and make sure that the students were keeping on track. After the students finished each weekly game, they were then required to fill out a survey, and the survey was designed to track their gameplay strategies, how effective they were, and how their language was reflecting how these strategies were changing. I used Google Forms to conduct the survey, and I designed the survey to measure 8 specific things. The first is to measure their strategy, or to have them tell me what their strategy was at the start of each game, whether they won or lost that game, the number of victory points that they obtained by the end of the game, their observations on how trade affected the outcome of the game and how they could change their strategy to improve their trading, observations on how resource management affected the outcome of the game, and again, how they could change their strategy regarding resource management in order to effectively get better at the game. Their observations on how supply and demand was functioning in the game and how they can change that in order to get better at the game. And then finally, how they plan to change their overall game strategy for the next game that they were going to play. And here are some of the results that I achieved. Now, I think what you'll see in this data, hopefully, is that the game, by the students interacting with this game, that they were able to develop strategies for dynamic situations. And I'll be saying this over and over again, but the dynamic situation of the game itself is that each scenario of the game is necessarily different. And this is really important in looking at how the students have changed their strategies in order to accommodate for this dynamic situation. So here's a ratio of our wins to losses. Obviously, we have a lot more losses than wins. None of the students had played this game before at the onset of the study. And so this is something that's to be expected, but we did see an overall trend of increasing averages for victory points. So the students were getting objectively better by playing the game and thinking about how they can change their strategy in order to get better at the game. And next we'll move into the qualitative data. Now, obviously, I don't have enough time to go through all of the qualitative data with you, but I did want to highlight the most important trend that I saw in looking through the qualitative data. So there's this general trend that I see that students at the start of the study had really specific strategies. And then towards the end of the study, they kind of shifted their strategies to make their strategies more malleable, or they developed a much better way of having a meta strategy, right? Of developing a strategy to create a strategy, essentially. So having a strategy to make a strategy for a dynamic situation. So for example, at the start of the study, you would see students, when asked about their general strategy for the game, they would say something very specific that for maybe one game, right? So for example, my strategy is to keep important resources. So I want to keep this specific resource and then build cities aggressively. Now, this is maybe a good strategy for that game. But again, all of these games are dynamic, right? We have this dynamic situation in the game where the situation is always changing. So every game is going to be different, right? So you might not be able to always keep the resources that you want because you might not get the resources that you want in every single game. And it is good to build cities. However, in other games, you might not have the resources or access to the resources to build cities. So maybe that's not the best strategy to win every single game, right? And towards the end of the study, you saw a shift in how a lot of the students were thinking about how to change their strategy. So for example, one of the students towards the end of the study said they wanted to change their strategy by looking at how other players were effectively playing the game. So this is, again, a much more meta approach to how they should be playing the game. So not developing one strategy for one specific game, but looking at how other players are playing many different games in order to develop their strategies. So for trade, again, you saw this the same kind of trend of students developing specific strategies for one game and then shifting their strategies to make them more malleable to dynamic situations. So for example, the student said that they wanted to have leverage over other players by always having the resources that were in demand. Again, unfortunately, because of the dynamic game mechanics that are built into the game, you can't always have the valuable resources to lord over the other players, so to speak. And then towards the end of the study, you had students having a much more malleable strategy, right? Talking about when to trade in the game, not specifically what they should be trading in the game, but when to trade in the game, which is a much more important way of looking at it in order to develop a strategy that is better for dynamic situations, a much more meta strategy. So this student said that they wanted to avoid trading with somebody in the latter half of the game. So this is very important, actually. It's more effective to trade with players in the first half of the game rather than in the latter half, because if you trade with players in the latter half, you're more likely to increase uh, the possibility that those players are going to win the game. Whereas at the beginning of the game, even if you give an or have there's an advantageous trade made with another player, that might not lead to that player winning the game. So it's a much more effective strategy to trade with somebody in the first half of the game rather than the latter half of the game. And this is a strategy that can be used in many different games, regardless of the situation. So for supply and demand, again, you see this shift of students maybe focusing in on one specific resource. So this student noticed that grain was really valuable in this game. But that's not to say that grain will always hold the same value in every game, or even throughout the entirety of one game. So the nature of the dynamic, the nature of the game being dynamic kind of ensures that the value of resources will shift throughout the game and in different games. And so you saw students kind of acknowledge this dynamic situation by saying that, or acknowledging the fact that the value of resources shifts throughout the game, right? So at the beginning of maybe one game, wood and brick are important, but at the end of the game, they're less valuable, right? So there's this shifting of value, so you can't always place the same value on certain resources in dynamic situations. Okay, so generally, what these results imply is that smartphone gaming, such as using the Settlers of Catan to teach general business strategy to cope with dynamic situations, can be both effective and motivating. So, um, not only is there near universal penetration of smartphones in our university classes, but we can easily use these smartphones to teach things like business strategy by utilizing not necessarily the specific game, the Settlers of Catan, but there's a number of resources that are available on smartphones that can provide engaging target language tasks in EFL contexts. The students also showed continual improvement quantitatively. So the students were gradually getting better at the game. And they also showed qualitatively a growing understanding of how trade, resource management, and supply and demand function in the game, and more specifically, how to develop strategies that cope with the dynamic situation of how trade, resource management, and supply and demand function in the game. Furthermore, the students were also highly motivated to keep developing their strategies. So not only did you see the objective improvements in how they were playing the game, but also by interacting with the students in class, a number of the students showed quite a high level of enthusiasm to play the game and to keep playing the game, which is very important. The situations, as I said earlier, and many times, the situations presented in the game are dynamic. So each game will not be the same. The resources, the value of each resource will not always be the same in every single game. And the resources that you're able to collect in each game will not always be the same. So it's always going to be shifting. So you have to kind of change your strategy to shift along with that situation. And this is mirrored in real life business scenarios. So business is highly unpredictable, such as, for example, the coronavirus, right? So if businesses don't have good strategies to deal with the dynamic situations that come up, such as the coronavirus, then they're less likely to succeed. And so it's really important that if we're teaching our students how to develop good business strategies, that we're teaching them to develop the critical thinking skills that allow them to create strategies that cope with these dynamic situations. And furthermore, if we're teaching business in an English setting, then we want to provide our students with the opportunity to develop these strategies while using the English language and utilizing smartphone gaming, such as the Settlers of Catan. It can provide an easy and effective and motivating way to do that. Okay, so here are a list of my references that I use throughout the study. If you have any questions or comments about this study, you can contact me at either of these email addresses, or you can find me by searching for Kevin Wrobetz at researchgate.net. Thank you.